Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Hal Levinka, and I'm the event director of the bookstore, and I'm absolutely thrilled today to welcome Lucie Elven here to present her debut novel, The Weak Spot, in conversation with Kathryn Scanlan. While the pandemic has taken a toll across all of our lives, virtual programs like the one you're about to see have become bright spots in our days, and I want to give a huge thanks to Lucie and Kathryn for taking the time to join us today. So to some housekeeping, you should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have any questions, please click on the Q&A button here at the bottom of your screen to submit them. We will try to get through as many of those as we can at the end of the program. There's also a chat button down here where I'm going to be posting a link to purchase this evening's books if you haven't already, very important. A caveat for tonight's event and for all virtual events, we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please bear with any technical issues that could arise. We will try to solve those quickly. And finally, we have a whole schedule of spring programming ahead of us virtually. So head over to our website and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One that I want to point out, tomorrow evening, we are thrilled to welcome Patricia Lockwood to present her new novel, No One Is Talking About This, in conversation with playwright Heidi Schreck. Again, that is up on our website now, so you can head over and register as soon as we wrap this program up. So now a little about tonight's guests, and we will get started. Lucie Elven has written for publications including the London Review of Books, Granta, and Noon. The Weak Spot is her first book, and she lives in London, where she's joining us from. So thank you, Lucie, for staying up. And for anyone watching, thank you for staying up. And Kathryn Scanlan is the author of August 9th, Fog, and The Dominant Animal. Her work has been published in Noon, Granta, The Paris Review, and Another Gaze. She lives in Los Angeles. So I believe that Lucie's going to open things up with a reading.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. So I'm going to read from the beginning of the book. The river moved quickly for such an unrushed place, curling around the base of the mountain, and at the crest of the town lay the golden side of a ruined abbey. A graveyard hung behind it, falling like a veil, 2 stones here, 3 there, others farther out, dug into the rock face and jagging horizontally over the precipice as if these sidelong burials had been a punishment for crimes. Between the fir trees, long light-headed candles extending out of a steep incline, a passage had been carved out for the funicular. As it wound up its ancient ticking mechanism, another car was coming down. We passed it in midair, a man chatting between 2 police officers and a woman standing by the driver. The light on them looked as solid as drapery. Even on such a blue day, you could tell this sky had a knack for breaking into storms. It was almost the time of my appointment with Mr. Malone when I arrived at the square with the pharmacy, a corner building so fastidiously closed it looked folded up. I stood in the middle of the plaza and turned in a full circle so that the houses rotated around me. Their second floors, which must have been the most desirable when the town was built, had shutters that were taller than those on any other floor. Above them, in some cases, were rows of square windows. I was thinking of my mother, for whom the 3rd floor was the one that is tiring to get to. The floor that was a mystery, where any dangerous transformation may be happening to me. I lost sight of her when I saw a dog trotting along the edge of the square. On its trail was a pair of shoes clacking loudly. It was Mr. Malone with sunglasses on, whose face was bronzed and rich compared to his photograph on the Institute website. The dog, followed by Mr. Malone, took a corner into an alley off the square to the right of the pharmacy. The dog kept on to the end, and Mr. Malone seemed to speed up, then stop himself and watched it go. He reached into his jacket pocket and unlocked a side door. A minute later, with a grinding, the shop's metal security grille cranked up. Inside, wearing his white coat in front of the counter, Mr. Malone said, "Tell me about yourself." He followed up with questions like, "Why did you choose this town? When did you decide to train as a pharmacist?" I studied him. He was a large man of around 50 with an upper lip that drooped beautifully over his mouth. He looked unregulated and liable to weep, yet also orderly, a wardrobe out of whose stuffed shelves coats and pillows would tumble if you opened the door without care. It started there at the beginning of our relationship, as soon as we met. Maybe it was because I'd seen him captivated by the stray dog, and I knew he was behaving differently now he was on his guard. I didn't tell him anything. I didn't say that I had been near the town once on holiday when I was a child. My uncle had taken my mother and me on an interminable walk. We were on a path around the mountain, but as a joke, my uncle had lied and told me we would be heading right up it. It was so foggy that we couldn't see where we were going. Every so often, he would point into the mist and announce, "Look, we're getting closer." As we went, he had overpowered us with stories about a mythical local monster that devoured humans headfirst, about a nun who had turned into a hillock, about the black sheep of the family who had moved to a house nearby and pinned live flies under the needle of a gramophone so that they were slowly dismantled as he listened to Ravel. Later, I learned that it was a part of the country that deviants run away to in books, a place for murderers, thieves, and alcoholic former lawyers to lie low, a landscape full of abrupt drops, deep craters, boars, snakes, and wolves, a vast sleeping boundary, a safe haven. At the end of my studies, the town appeared on the list of the possible places to train. I wanted to see if I could measure up to this wildness. No one had quite said I couldn't, so I applied. As for why I wanted to be a pharmacist at all, that had no answer I was able to share with Mr. Malone. When I responded in a deliberate monotone, guessing at what I might be expected to say, he interjected to check that he had understood a point or to ask about my private life. He told me to read my list of queries about the position aloud, rather than raise them one by one. He said he hoped that some link between my areas of uncertainty would lead us to an interesting topic of conversation. He asked if I knew the process for being approved by the pharmacy board after his 2-month mentorship. He answered his own question. On his recommendation, I would interview over several hours with several more members of the Institute, after which 2 separate people had to approve me. Only then would I be allowed to run my own pharmacy. Mr. Malone seemed to be snapping at me and cutting me off because he had already decided that I was not ready for the role. By all rights, I shouldn't have inserted myself into this thin-aired, close-knit mountain town, to me just a shapeless place where I felt something had been interrupted. My decision had been unrestrained, reckless. He mentioned that some people prefer to wait until they have children before training, then apologize for presuming. I explained to him that I had a strong instinct that this was what I wanted to do, and he said, yes, that came across. I clearly had profound emotions about it. I must have looked desperate as I explained I wasn't usually wrong when I acted on this sort of impulse. Something flickering entered his eyes. He asked me if I had any more questions, and I paused for as long as I thought would convey my ability to abide an uncomfortable situation, then said no. He disappeared down a forest green corridor into a back office. When I'm angry, it's often a sign that I'm trying to work something out, and this was surely what was happening now. I walked down the aisles and stared at a display of baby bottles, trying to draw a practical conclusion from this discouraging introduction. After all, he had struck a chord with me when he agreed how important this opportunity was. He had created a deep trench of feeling in the room during our conversation. But then Mr. Malone came back into the front of the shop. He was briefly generous in explaining his philosophy. He believed that a pharmacist's role was to enhance the locals' potential by listening skillfully. When he was a child, Mr. Malone said he had told his parents that he wanted to restore old cities. The town was forgetting itself year on year, and the municipal authorities did such a careless job preserving its dignity and protecting the habits of the community that young women, especially, were moving away. When they visited their families, they had new sing-song voices as though they were on the radio, which seemed a betrayal to the older generation. The world was changing fast, and people here always felt their efforts to keep up were a little off. They were trying to attract a new doctor, as the last one had retired to the city. Patients had to attend appointments over the internet, which was slow. Only that morning, the mayor had been arrested. He was facing accusations of tax fraud. That was why our work at the pharmacy was particularly necessary. Mr. Malone said that when the bell over the door rang, I was to experience customers' needs more urgently and their disappointments more keenly than my own. I was to ask them what they were hoping for, about their ambitions, and I was to remember all those details for the next time they came. Then his level of emotion went from overflowing to nothing. His face became a window with drawn curtains. He retired again to the back office.
Thank you, Lucie, for reading that. And thank you for this book, which I really love. And I feel like that first chapter is such a good chapter to read because I've read the book a few times now, and I feel like going back to read it again, it's it's kind of remarkable how the whole book is sort of contained in that first chapter in a way. But there's like there's so many things that I want to talk to you about. But I guess I was thinking maybe we could just start out in a very broad way, and I could ask you where the idea for the book came from, or what made you start working on it, or how long you've been working on it.
Where did it come from? It came from two things. One of them was just going to the pharmacy. So my French family come from this part of France that's quite kind of hot in the summer, quite cold in the winter. In the local folk tales, it's described as having 3 months of hell and 9 months of winter. So really quite hot in the summer. And we would only go in the summer, and sometimes we would go to the pharmacy, and obviously the pharmacy would be a very cool place, and it was often like presided over by like a woman pharmacist who would, like, you know, seem very authoritative, very modern, in a part of the world where things were sort of like all about family and all about like gossip and all about like knowing everything about the history, and that was kind of like really refreshing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have a good memory of pharmacies for that reason. And then the other thing was that I have a friend who moved to a remote island, and someone told me, so I didn't even hear this firsthand, I heard it sort of secondhand on the grapevine, that the pharmacist on the island sort of had this huge amount of social power, and he sort of used it to his own advantage. And so I was thinking about, you know, whether that was the case also in the kind of place that I would go to in France, and what you can do with that sort of information about people.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like the setting is very interesting to me of the book? It feels like the opening scene, I feel like, I don't know, there's something about it that reminded me of like some like 19th century novels that I remember reading a long time ago, or like maybe even like Dracula, you know, like this kind of train voyage to this mountain town, that, and you know, kind of an ominous image as your first image, this really strange sounding graveyard at the top, and the abbey. I just wonder, is the town based at all on the town that you spent time in France?
Not really.
Yeah.
No, I wasn't thinking of a specific place.
Mm-hmm.
But I did use like some names of places nearby. There's this kind of it was more like the atmosphere of as I say in that like opening, there's this kind of two-sidedness to it, where it's both like a safe place to run away to, and also this very wild landscape. And I like the village names sort of reflect that. So there are places called like Cutthroat and like Deadfield, and like these quite escrow, like crime names of crime. And then there are other ones that are called like Relief and Hello, and like very sweet things like Little Prune. There's one's called Little Prune. So you kind of have these like completely different states that are reflected in like just even on the map. So I kind of used that, but no, there was not a like specific town. What there was is like this image of the abbey did come from like a really specific it's actually a castle that is very striking to me, and there are those graves that kind of stick out over the precipice, and I don't know why that image stuck with me so much, but it did.
When we were emailing last week you mentioned that there were some folk tales that you had studied that were part of that were from the region that you spent time in, and then I actually this morning read the piece that you published in Ziziva about that was a little bit about those. I wonder if maybe you could just talk about those a little bit and like how those came into the book.
Yeah, so that came in like really late on actually, and I was sort of, not necessarily, it was quite an odd move for me, I thought, because I didn't, I wasn't thinking of it as like a fable really, as a story, and but yeah, no, by chance my grandfather located these completely lost, like completely out of print folk tales that were based on the oral history of the region, and they have quite a complicated history. I mean, there are different books, but some of them have a pretty complicated history, and the ones that he sent me were just, to me, like so unlike anything else I had read. That they were like all about the physical world, like not at all about the life of the mind or like why people make decisions. And it's so refreshing once you've read like lots of books in the 21st century to read just about human behavior without too much I mean, I love torturous kind of scenes of decision making or whatever, but it is interesting to read things without that. My book is full of torturous scenes of introspection, but yeah, so I found that really, really amazing, and also like the relationship to shame in these stories. Like there's a lot of like self-flagellation, just humiliation, like social embarrassment of various kinds. It was just very, very, very visceral reading experience. And then so the way I used them was like right at the end, there were some phrases that I translated or altered or tried to kind of use to a different purpose. And my rule was that there had to be like a kind of transformation happening. So I mean, obviously they are very different because they're in a different language, and I've like modernized them, but I also used them in a different way. So like there was a line about like a violent and solitary wind blowing over, like, for instance, the valley or something like that. And at one point I have the accountant sort of breathing out, and the narrator describes it as being like a violent and solitary wind, but it's like kind of a joke because he's just kind of melodramatic. It was just kind of a way of I guess like integrating, like both like grounding the stories and also like trying to use these stories that I think, grounding my novel and trying to use these stories that I think have this like slightly like sentimental and therefore like uncomfortable tone to them, and kind of subvert them or change them, put them to like a purpose that I'm kind of more comfortable with than some of the purposes they've been historically used for.
Sort of like moralistic purposes or like learning purposes, you mean?
Moralistic, and also one of the books which I didn't really use but I was like kind of more acquainted with had been used like by it wasn't necessarily that book, but the person who collected the folk tales had been like enlisted by Maréchal Pétain, the kind of leader of the of occupied France, so who collaborated with the Axis forces. And so like it was just kind of this kind of return to the land, like far right nationalism, and obviously that's not the story's fault that the person who wrote them had went off on that in that direction, but it's still like part of their history. And it was interesting to think about like sentimentalism and like why stories feel authentic and why we kind of cherish them, hold them up as like especially important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So had you started working on the book then, like before you sort of came across those stories, or was that like, had you started writing things and then decided that those were going to be something that you were going to weave in and, like you say, ground the book, or those were there from the beginning? Is it?
No, they were there like right at the end. Actually, there were some of the last ones. Yeah. So at first I was thinking about like, I don't know, listening and speaking and like interpersonal dynamics, and as it became more obviously about that part of about childhood and kind of about how like childhood can translate into like the experiences you have in childhood can maybe like be mapped onto adulthood, I then started looking at the stories.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, the gardeners sounds like they started across the street. I hope that isn't going to be too loud. I can't decide where I should go right now, because I feel like I want to ask you about writing stories, but I also, like, before we leave this, that essay where you're talking about this stuff, there was a line that I wanted to read from it. Is that okay? I really loved this line from your essay, and you're talking about these, receiving these tales from your grandparents. And you say, the stories progressed at a clip and with confidence, the narrator steering me from one sentence to the next, relishing action over psychology in their study of human behavior. And I feel like that sentence just like so perfectly sums up like what I like in fiction, or even like what I try to do in fiction, and like and it's really interesting to me to hear that this aspect of using these stories, or the idea of these stories, came in late in the book, because in a way the whole book sort of feels that way to me. I mean, you said something earlier about the book being full of sort of like torturous psychological movements, but I know what you mean, and I think that that's true, but at the same time I also feel like the tone of the book, I mean, and your writing as a whole, your short fiction that I've read as well, like I feel like it really has that tone of sort of like lightness and speed, and also just like mystery and authority, which are the things that kind of characterize these kinds of tales.
I did find
yeah, sorry, go ahead. I had a question in there somewhere, but I lost it.
I found the mystery part kind of interesting, because I think I'm not going to be able to articulate it now, but there's there was a quality to the stories, because they didn't explain everything, and kind of just, it felt like either gossip or like the person telling the story didn't really know everything. And I think that that's something that I'm interested in, like how it feels to tell a story without really knowing every aspect of the events. And that's definitely something I was thinking about when I was writing the book.
Yeah, I mean, and that's definitely something that is like a great strength of the book. I feel like that it's a very philosophical and psychological book, at the same time that it doesn't really hold your hand or explain everything to you, and it leaves a lot of things out, which I find very exciting. And then I don't know, so I think that just the style of the book really felt like a tale that way to me. And then it made me think about, I mean, I guess I should probably get derailed with my question here because you're saying that wasn't necessarily like a guiding influence, but I was just thinking about how, those sorts of tales are usually narrated, by an omniscient narrator in the third person. And I guess I was just kind of wondering what made you choose to write this book in the first person?
So I started off in the first person and I went back to it, but I did have a brief phase where it was in the third person.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it was really interesting because I heard, like, I thought it was brilliant in the third person. I was like, this is genius, this is what it's missing. And actually it didn't work at all. And it was helpful because apparently Jane Austen did this. She'd write things in the first person and then change them into the third person. And you can kind of see how that comes out in her writing, because what I found was that basically it was like, it created the illusion that I had known exactly where to put the psychologically revealing stuff. If you change from the first person to the third person, it creates that illusion. But then I was like, once I was in the third person, I was like, I'm missing all this physical detail. Like, it's just all in someone's head. It's not got any mannerisms. It's not got anything, physical and like earthy to it. And so I added all of that, and then I switched back to the first person. And the first person made a lot more sense because I wanted the reader to feel like complicit in the like self-distraction of the narrator, who basically tells herself all these stories and like imagines the lives of the people in the town, and also like distracts herself from what's actually going on around her and how she's really feeling, and isn't, I feel like, in denial about the things that are happening. And so yeah, putting it back in the first person like allowed me to make the reader complicit, and also like, I don't know, like maybe to manipulate the reader a bit, which I kind of enjoyed. Like I found that to be like, well, it's not behavior that the narrator engages in a lot because she's not very confident in her narration, but she goes through these phases where she kind of thinks, okay, I've got it, I think, and she sort of narrates things with some confidence, and then something happens and it's shaken. So yeah, I quite liked the kind of ability to disorient the reader.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it just is so smart. Like, it works so well because the book is actually about abuse, right? Like, it's about I mean mostly psychological abuse of this person that the narrator works with, and but also like her uncle and a few of the other people that she has encounters with. But the way that the story is told, it's almost like kind of experiencing that ourselves, because it's told in this sort of this ambiguous way where maybe we're not always sure what's going on, and we can sort of withhold judgment about what's going on because because we're not getting, we're getting what we're getting from the narrator is so kind of slippery.
Yeah. And also, like, I guess like one of the things that I was trying to understand right at the beginning of writing was, how can I, Lucie, like empathize with and understand like a state of denial that's so complete as the narrator's. And I feel like one of the reasons why people go into denial, or at least one of the things that I was considering, was that like that they don't like ambiguity, like they can't stand it and they have to shut it down. And when they see something and they don't know exactly what's happening, they react with discomfort, and it's understandable because ambiguity is like intense and also like lacks like substantive content, you know, so it's not a pleasant state, but at the same time the alternative is worse. And I was trying to show, like, just observe like the way that the narrator you know, finds it like exhausting, like physically exhausting to be around this character, Annie, who she works with, who has this thing happen to her, this kind of situation. She says it's like being in front of like a mysterious painting all day, and she just wants to go to the gift shop in the museum and like exchange currency and like forget about it, you know. And I think I really empathize with that. I think it is how people react to that kind of uncertainty. And I guess like Elsa like finds Annie like infuriating as well. Like basically, yeah, if you're missing a piece of information, then yeah, it's easy to kind of blame the person who, like the wrong person. I guess that's facile, true.
I feel like we could talk more about Annie Milk, but I also want to talk about how so, you know, a lot of the book is the narrator training, but she's not really being instructed by Mr. Malone, the pharmacist. She's just sort of doing it herself, but she's, you know, she's studied medicine for years, and she has all this training, and then she comes to find that this job is actually just sort of listening to people talk about, you know, their ostensibly their ailments, but you know, it comes to seem very much like you know, their psychological conditions, the things that they want in life, the things they feel like they don't have in life, are maybe causing their ailments, or those are the things that they actually want to talk about, and they don't necessarily want, like, the prescription that the narrator has to give them, or the cure is basically words. I just think that is such an interesting idea, and I mean, there's so many things there, because I feel like it, yeah, I guess I just wonder, like, do you think of language as potentially a cure, or like a curative, or writing a book, or can a book be something like that? Like, is it the language that is this, I'm sorry, is it the language that's the solution, or is it more just like the having someone listen to you and intuitively know what you want to hear, or what's going to help you in that moment?
I think it's a bit of both. I think that there is an extent to which, you know, language is very powerful in that regard, and I find that like I find that like a very tempting idea, and I see myself constantly slipping into thinking that I can solve an issue by putting it well, like well, or else phrasing it differently. But you know, there's also like the world and power and all these things that aren't necessarily behaving the same way for different people, and like your language can be more or less effective. So with regards to like, can a book say, probably not. I think this idea about like listening is really interesting, and like I love. I feel like one of the kind of positive things in the book, one of the kind of solution, like the things that kind of emerged for me is a like sustaining or whatever it is, the idea that like we talk about like speech and listening in these ways that suggest that there's like an individual and there's another person, and they come at it with like their own, worlds, and they kind of don't really collide or relate with each other. But I think that in fact, like I tried to draw out moments like where things are like actually a lot more relational than that, and like you can only have certain thoughts if you're in an environment where people will like encourage you or like listen to you, or even when someone else is talking, like it's quite sometimes hard to have thoughts on your own. You kind of need to be interrupting someone, or like even like physical stuff is sometimes more often than we think like contagious. So this thing about, there's a scene where she goes to the hospital and then she faints because there's a blood being taken, and she kind of is convinced that she's fainted because she saw someone else faint. And, that's real. That is a real phenomenon.
Is that what you said?
Yeah.
I love that. I've never heard of that. I love that scene too, because the narrator kind of knows that is what has happened, and the man who has fainted, who has like caused her to faint, just like wants nothing to do with this conversation. Like he like does not respond, does not seem to believe in that at all as a possibility, even though the nurses are saying that it is.
Yeah, he just ignores it. Yeah,
I think that too, talking about listening and conversations and stuff, I think that like thinking about that and about how the events seem to kind of turn after a particular conversation. I'm remembering a conversation between Helen Stoll and Elsa and the narrator, and there seem to be like several kind of key, pivotal moments in the book, in the narrator's sort of time in this town, where events change after she's had these conversations with other women, where suddenly she feels like she's in such a cloud of confusion that has been like of mental confusion that has been created by this pharmacist, that this power hungry crazy pharmacist that she's been working for. And then all of a sudden, when she can have these conversations with these other women, it kind of lifts.
Yeah, and she's not even sure if they're like, she regrets them, or she's like, I know in the morning I'll think I'm making this up.
Right.
Yeah.
I wanted, so go ahead. I wanted to ask about the when we had been emailing earlier, one of the things I had talked about maybe bringing up was the significance of the third floor. There's third floor on the pharmacy, where the narrator, it's like early on she has this intuition that this might be a place that she can go and sort of transform herself, and then it seems like she does that. I wonder if you could just maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so the narrator goes through so much of the book just avoiding her feelings and becoming increasingly managerial and afflicted by her savior complex, and methodical, and that becomes untenable as a way of seeing things, because she fails to to help in this situation that she doesn't notice. And so I kind of saw the third floor. She had a bedroom on the third floor when she was younger. She has this dream about being chased or having racing kind of wolf to the room on the third floor, and then she ends up moving into the third floor of the pharmacy, which is sort of a place that hasn't even occurred to her to go to. And I guess I liked the possibility that she could have basically not necessarily a breakdown, but like have a space in which she's paying very careful attention to everything, and time sort of works differently, and it's kind of like the days are sort of porous, and it's sort of like there's this sort of green lights, that sort of like fluid space where she processes the stuff that's happening around her, and also like learns to integrate, because she's like inviting her uncle to visit her, so she learns to integrate the things in her life that she's been separating off.
And in the meantime, she's running down to the pharmacy every now and then when it's empty and no one's there, and getting the things that she needs for herself during this time, which I really liked.
Yeah, it's the dream.
It was kind of like a dreamy sequence where it sounded like such a wonderful fantasy. I loved it.
Yeah.
I feel like I see that we're already getting kind of advanced in time. I guess maybe I just want to ask you one more thing, and then I guess we would go to the Q&A, even though I have a lot more here in my notes. But I just wanted to ask you a really like basic question about, like, because I knew your work first as short fiction in Noon, and loved it right away. I should say I remember reading, like, you know, the first of your stories that was in Noon, and I just immediately loved it. The things that you do in sentences are so interesting to me. Like, I feel like every sentence is a surprise. Like, it does not go in any way that I can anticipate, and it's just like, it's such a wonderful feeling to read something like that.
Thank you, Kathryn.
And I was wondering, I'm guessing you were writing those before you started working on this book. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So, and I was thinking about the form of this book, and it's got these sort of short chapters that give it a great energy and speed, I feel like, and the short chapters are each titled with these wonderful titles that really remind me of Diane Williams and like her, especially her novellas, and I feel like that's been a huge influence on me too. And like the novel that I've been working on for the last couple of years, like I'm doing the same thing, like having these, and I just wonder if is that the bridge? Is that something that was like helpful for you to like write in this way that has more of, there's like a flow from one to the next. It's not like they're individual stories that jump around very much, but they still have that energy. Rare. I don't know. I think it's really exciting to read. But
I'm really excited for your novel. I tried. It started off not like that at all, though. It started off like a novella in 3 parts. Like when it went on submission, it was just a mass, basically.
Really?
Yeah, but it didn't.
So interesting.
I shouldn't have done that. It was a mistake.
Why do you think it was a mistake? I think it worked out.
I mean, I'm glad I broke it up into pieces. I guess, yeah, like I wanted to, I really love novellas, and I was really interested in that kind of lyricism and that flow from the beginning to the end, and the kind of like kind of looping back to things, but mostly going in one direction. But once I broke it up into parts, it was so much more manageable, and it kind of makes sense for the story, because it's about, you know, story, like at the beginning at least, it's a lot of kind of anecdotes that are being told to her, and things that she's imagining. But yes, definitely, you know, can't overstate the influence of Diane Williams, and you know, like there's she like very kindly like read the beginning of it when I thought it was a short story right at the start, and was so helpful just to clarify what was working, what wasn't. And yeah, it's I'm glad that you think it has the energy. It is different. Like there were things that felt different. Like by the end, I felt like there was this sort of forward pull, which I don't really necessarily feel like in the same way with short stories. But like because I kind of like got to a point where I knew what it was trying to do, and so the bit with the uncle kind of came out in a straight line, which I never like happens with short stories.
Yeah, it felt though, I mean, that didn't feel, you know, like any kind of forced, you know, novelistic or narrative convention or anything like that. To me, it felt like it came very naturally from the story, and I thought it worked really, really well.
I was really anxious about the novel, like it was like the novel, you know.
Yeah.
I didn't want to. I don't really like. There are some things about the novel that I was ready to explore, but like for instance, I was interested in how like a character can be refracted through lots of different situations, but I wasn't ready to like think about some things to do with the novel, or like the novel as like a tradition or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that I was really resistant to it for a long time also. That reminds me of this thing that you said when we were emailing that I wanted to ask you about, even though I said that was going to be the last question, but you said, what did you say? That you were taken aback by this book, by the fact that you had written this book.
Yeah, when did I write it? Like I can't really remember most of the writing process. I didn't have a desk. Yeah, no, I am like deeply uncomfortable with it, deeply embarrassed about it, and also like really happy that I've done it, and like so it's just but yeah, it's, you know, it's a book about like ambiguity and discomfort and stuff, so it was never going to be like something I could sit back and feel uncomplicated about. But I'm often, you know, even on short stories, I don't know if you have the same experience, but sometimes I'll send a short story to Noon and there'll be something wrong with it, and it will come back. Like one time I sent a story about these two schoolgirls who were harvesting their eggs, and it came back and it was just, you know, like a little paragraph, and it was clearly not about that at all. It was like I felt like I'd been psychoanalyzed and that was the only bit that was important, and it was like absolutely not about two schoolgirls harvesting their eggs. And so I sometimes have that experience where it feels like a story will take me aback, and that it will be like staring into the sun a bit, like when it comes back in its like, you know, edited form. Do you have that?
I mean, you're talking specifically about Noon.
About Diane.
Yeah, about Diane. Yeah, absolutely. Yes,
Yeah.
I have had that experience, and I think, I also just find it uncomfortable you know, to sort of see what I write, what I end up writing. And but yeah, definitely with Diane, sometimes there have been occasions where it's like, oh, how could I be so unconscious as to know that this is what I was writing about, or this is what I was not writing about. But
But
the
that's
only,
what's good
the only
about it.
what's that?
That's what's good about it. It's like
Exactly. Yes.
you can produce these unconscious things, without any sort of sense of control over what's happening.
Yeah, and I do feel like having that experience is like invaluable in a way that it has helped me become more conscious of what I'm doing, you know, and I mean, hopefully not too conscious, because I do think that there's something to be said to be a little bit unaware of what you're doing as you're doing it, but it definitely has been psychologically helpful, I think, and on a craft level as well.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna go to Q&A because it looks like there are some questions. Okay, I guess I'll just read through all of these. This first one is from Jason. Can you talk a bit about the themes of surveillance that run through the novel? I grew up in a small town and really connected with the idea that everyone is looking at everyone in a sense.
I think about this morning, and about kind of privacy. It's true that the book has a lot of watching, like the kind of Mr. Malone, the head pharmacist, sits behind the narrator and comments on her appearance, and asks her colleague to check check up on her, check up that she's not doing anything she shouldn't be doing, and yeah, there's kind of a lot of gossip, but that came from just just observing these small, detailed interactions in mostly in one room. It wasn't really like I wasn't thinking about themes very much. It's just that that I guess like that's present in our lives, and so I don't have like a kind of broad point to make about surveillance, but I think that the idea of also performance and like having an inner life or not having one is related in some way that I'm not able to articulate.
Let's see, this is from Andrew. In addition to the found folk tales, were there other authors, books, literary traditions you had in mind or took inspiration from while writing?
Yeah, loads. I was reading this book by a guy who ran a medical museum here in London called Flesh in the Age of Reason, which is about the relationship between the body and the mind and like the soul over history. And that was really, that had this idea in it that at some point, and I don't know who, people thought that the events in your life could shake you in the same way as illnesses. And I guess that's something that we think again, but it was a very long time ago that people thought this, and that was a really interesting thing to start off with. And also I was reading Anne Carson has an essay about I guess about somaticism, which is a word you taught me over email, which about how feelings can kind of manifest in the body, and she looks at all these different examples, and one of them is like Greek women who somehow grew beards when they thought that their city was under attack, which is I think in literature. I'm not sure if it's happened in real life, but that was really interesting. I was also thinking a lot about desire and like how difficult it is to articulate desire, which is something that my narrator kind of seems to feel like she doesn't even know what she wants. Kind of halfway through the book, she decides she wants a cigarette, and you didn't even know that she smoked. In fact, she's been turning down cigarettes. So, like, I mean, Giovanni's Room. There's this book, like lots.
Yeah, that's weird. I didn't even think about Cusk when I was reading it, but that the way that you deliver the stories from the other characters, yeah, I can see that. Let's see, this is from someone anonymous. Did you have a process of elision in deciding what and how you wanted to leave information out of the narrative?
No, no, because it kind of grew into that narrative. It wasn't like I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't plan it in advance. It was more like, as with a short story, sort of cobbling together things that felt like they were like emotionally sort of bouncing off each other and discovering something. It was like I wasn't in control of what was happening in the story. Although, I mean, that sounds like pretty like a lie, and maybe it's a way of deceiving yourself into writing a certain story, but I wasn't trying to control the reader. Although, actually, no, that is obviously a lie, isn't it? Yeah, I guess I was, but I didn't. There's nothing that I know that I've not said.
Fergus asks, who would you like to play Mr. Malone in a movie adaptation of the book?
Good question, Fergus. Lots of dead people. I've been thinking a lot about this. I was at first when I started writing, I was thinking a lot about Alfred Hitchcock and how Alfred Hitchcock like talks about montage, and how Mr. Malone is sort of similar in that he sort of like frames events, or like sets things up in such a way that things look like they look to his advantage. So like if I could have Alfred Hitchcock play him, I would 100% have that.
That would be excellent. Yuka says, so interesting to hear that the book changed from first to third person and back again, and the idea that you wanted the reader to feel complicit in the self-destruction of the narrator. I wondered if you had any thoughts or opinions about the idea of unreliable narrators in fiction.
That's a very difficult question. I kind of think that it's very pleasant to be taken by the hand by someone who's very confident and who is very powerful and who is telling you how things are. But ultimately, do you trust that person? Like if you have like a so-called reliable narrator, do you like, are there any? I don't know. Like I don't know if I trust people who who tell stories like so perfectly and so unimpeachably. That's not that sounds dangerous to me. But I think that my narrator isn't like, I mean, I guess she's unreliable in that you shouldn't take her word for it, but she's not, she's representing these dynamics that are how she sees things. And, you know, we tend to think of like denial as being maybe I'm wrong, but that I used to think of it as being, you know, people who just don't want to know something, but on some level do. And maybe that's right, but the level is so much deeper than what we think. And it's exhausting constructing these kind of fictions in order to maintain a level of denial. And that's a valid, you know, or that's a real like endeavor that people do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
Anonymous person says, towards the end of the novel, it seems like the narrator is growing into her profession with characteristically mixed feelings. But do you imagine her continuing in it after the events described? And related to this, do you think about the future or past of your characters at all? Or do you only focus on the time span of your writing?
Yeah, I very much only focus on the time span. And I really resisted the idea of her leaving the town because I thought it was too easy. Will she carry on being a pharmacist? I think so. I think, yeah, I assume so. Maybe somewhere nice, somewhere quiet by the sea.
Madeline says, reading your stories and the novel, I'm struck by how you can evoke a whole character by their name alone. What is the process of naming your characters? Does the name or idea of a character come first? And I just have to add to that myself that makes me immediately think of Alfred Mossboof, who was in your your essay, which is one of the best names I think I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Alfred Massages Beef.
Massages beef. The process for naming the characters, I really don't like naming characters, and I find it pins them down in a way that I don't like doing, but obviously you need them to have names. And I just went with the first name that, well, mostly went with the first name that, like how I was calling them in my head, which I think is quite a childlike way of referring to things. But in a way, I feel like that's appropriate for this book, and it's these people are sort of, I don't want them to come across as surreal, but they are maybe kind of reflecting something about the narrator's own childhood and in some way kind of reflections. Yeah.
We have two. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I just don't feel like I answered the question. But I can't go much further, so yeah.
I mean, it kind of sounds like you're saying that it's a lot of like sort of chance in a way, where it's like first thing that comes to mind, that it sounds like maybe the idea for the character comes first, right?
Yeah.
Looks like there's two more questions. This one says, congratulations, Lucie. I've always enjoyed your writing, even back in San Francisco ages ago when we were interns at McSweeney's. I've always admired your subtle, supple, and disturbingly quiet prose. As I was reading your debut, I kept thinking about Sebald's declaration, namely that my medium is prose, not the novel. I am tempted to characterize your work as part of this tradition of writing, which seems to trust language itself to do that work of revealing meaning or lack thereof. But I am also disturbed by this distinction or delineation between prose and the novel. Since the novel is the consummate form of prose, it would be splendid to hear your thoughts on this enigmatic opposition between prose and the novel.
Wow. I don't agree, and in that I don't think that the novel is like the best form of prose. I do think that language kind of divorced, what you said about Sebald is interesting, and I think, you know, maybe Kathryn, we have this in common, I don't know, but I think that, yeah, having worked on that kind of minute level on short stories with Noon, language is the exciting thing, like sentences and paragraphs and rhythm, sound, and also like the power dynamics within sentences and what they do to the reader and how they frame events in different ways, changing ways. And I think that's what excites me. And the form of the novel is exciting when I read a really good one, which I think yours will be. I'm very, you know, I admire it so much, and I think I'd love to do that, but I don't know how people do that.
You don't know how people do what? Sorry.
Like write novels that feel like novels.
I mean, your novel feels like a novel. I think that maybe, yeah, I think that we, like what we were talking about earlier, wasn't necessarily like a dismissal of the novel or anything like that, right? It's more just this sort of like, I mean, to work at the level that I think that we both have kind of like been trained in or trained ourselves in, and where the excitement is, you know, this language excitement. I think that it's very difficult to sustain that in a long work, the length of a novel. And so it just seems like it's not as often that, I don't know, it's not as often that like every sentence is sort of weighed and considered and worked in this way that it is in short fiction. And so it's just, I think I was just trying to say that it felt to me like the novel that you've written has all of those qualities that I am really drawn to in short fiction, but you've sustained it, you know, over the length of the novel, which is wonderful.
Thank you.
Sorry, I don't know if I just confuse things further, but here's the last question. There's the great scene in the book where the narrator orders miniature furniture on the internet. I also really loved that scene, and it reminded me of a story that I've been meaning to write for a while. Anyway, thinking it's a great deal on regular furniture, but for the most part, the internet is conspicuously absent. Did you intentionally want to leave the internet out, as the book is about surveillance in so many ways?
Okay, so several things. Like at the time, I probably thought when I was writing, I probably thought that there's kind of there's like there are loads of books about the internet I think are really, really interesting, but keeping up with the internet. Firstly, I'm not very online. I'm not the right person to write that book, and secondly, yeah, it's not. I was more interested in dynamics that do happen on the internet, but are like also very much present in everyday life and in the kind of simplicity of the setting, and not. I feel like internet novels, as far as I've read them, require quite a lot of detail and position, like setting, and almost kind of a maximalist kind of sensibility. And I was more interested in having like a small room with a few characters and how they interact with each other. So yeah, it was absent in that I didn't think I was the right person to write that book.
I'm back. Well, I just wanted to thank both of you, Kathryn and Lucie, for joining us this evening or afternoon. Or Kathryn's an hour behind me. Lucie's 7 hours ahead of me. I don't know where anybody else is, but I hope whatever part of the day you're entering into, you are about to enjoy. Before we leave, just because once I hit go, we're gone. I'm going to repost the link to buy the book if you're in the US. If you're in the UK, please buy a UK edition because it will take 6 months for you to get a US edition from us. And otherwise, yeah, just everybody be well. Thank you again, Kathryn and Lucie. Lucie, congrats. And thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Kathryn.
Thank you. Thanks.
Good night.